Good afternoon to all of you. I am pleased to welcome you all for today's webinar on the EU Green Deal. What is it and what does it mean for Sri Lanka's agri-food suppliers? I am Gayani from the Export Agriculture Division of the EDB. I am pleased to be your moderator for today's session. This webinar is jointly organized by the Sri Lanka Export Development Board and the AGRINFO program implemented by COLEAD and funded by the European Union. Office of COLEAD is based in Brussels, Belgium. Stay with us actively for an insightful webinar to gain a comprehensive understanding of the EU Green Deal and its impact on our agri-food sector. Without further ado, let's start the session. Following the agenda, I would like to invite Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the Sri Lanka Export Development Board, Dr. Kingsley Bernard, to deliver the welcome remarks. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Good afternoon to all of you. I am indeed happy and privileged to welcome all of you to this very important webinar on EU Green Deal. Dr. Morag Webb, Head of Science and Policy, COLEAD, Dr. Chris Downs, Policy and Law Lead Expert, Sustainable Agri-Food Systems, COLEAD, Dr. Martin Van Brekkel, EU Policy and Regulations Expert, COLEAD, all participants from various government institutions and the private sector entities, my colleagues of the EDB, ladies and gentlemen. As the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Sri Lanka Export Development Board, which is the apex state organization responsible for the development and promotion of exports, it's a great pleasure and privilege for me to make the welcome remarks at this timely webinar on EU Green Deal, which is organized by the EDB together with the Agri-Info program implemented by COLEAD and funded by the European Union. I must say that it's an effective team up that EDB and the COLEAD have made, and this webinar is organized as a first step in the series of webinars activities to be organized collaboratively in the future. I must extend my sincere thanks for the team of COLEAD for their interest and the confidence towards the EDB to organize this event together with us in a very short time to share the information on the policy changes in the EU for the benefit of Sri Lankan entrepreneurs. European Union is the largest market for agri products from Sri Lanka, exported from Sri Lanka by value, which accounts for nearly 35% of SLS agri products export earnings at present. Further, more than 6,000 products are eligible for zero duty access to the EU region under the EU GSP Plus scheme. Therefore, sustainability in EU market is very important for us, and meeting the requirements, challenges of time is necessary for export sector. Having identified the challenges of the climate change and environmental degradation to the EU world, EU has embarked with the EU Green Deal to make the EU's climate, energy, transport and taxation policies fit for the reducing net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by the year 2030 compared to 1990 levels. The European Green Deal is the EU ambitions plan to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050 and boost its green economy. Accordingly, this webinar on EU Green Deal will provide you an overview of major EU policies and update on some of the major EU regulatory initiatives currently being developed in Brussels. This will also be an opportunity to find out about COLEAD's Agri-Info program and new information tool that provides the latest information on recent and upcoming challenges to EU rules. Therefore, I must be thankful for you for organizing this timely platform, connecting the experts of the EU Green Deal and the Sri Lanka entrepreneurs. We hope that this webinar will probably be helpful for our producers and exporters in getting ready for the new challenges and changes in the EU in every organized way, meeting the objectives of the both ends. I wish all the participants and speakers for a very successful session today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. In our virtual gathering today, we are joined by two proficient experts from COLEAD to help us to understand about the EU Green Deal, involvement of COLEAD in EU Green Deal, and the impact of Green Deal for supply or export of agri-based products from Sri Lanka. Dr. Morag Webb, Head of the Science and Policy, COLEAD. She leads the AGRINFO program. Dr. Chris Downis, Policy and Law Lead Expert, Sustainable Agri-Food Systems, Regulation and Standards Department, COLEAD. He is the one who coordinates the AGRINFO program. Before to hand over the floor to the experts, we would like to remind you to forward the questions, thoughts, and insights to the Q&A session. So Q&A section shown at the bottom of the screen. So during the interaction, Q&A during the interactive Q&A session, those will be considered and discussed. Let's make this just not a webinar, but a dynamic platform to share the details, helping each of us to understand more about the topics. Now, I would like to invite you, Dr. Morag and Dr. Chris, to take over the floor. Over to you, sir and madam.
Thank you very much for those opening words. Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and we're really very grateful to the EDB for giving us the opportunity to give you an overview of the new program and to let you know who we are and a little bit about what hopefully we may be able to do for you in terms of providing information. So what we'll do today is just give you a very brief overview of the European Green Deal and the associated initiatives. Because while this is an initiative, as Dr. Kingsley was explaining, this is something that's really addressing production in Europe and supply of agri-food products amongst many other. We have new rules, we have stricter rules, and there are differences in the way that these rules are being applied. And so we're going to go in a bit more detail on these later, but it's important to take on board that, that this is a slightly different dynamic that we're moving in terms of the way EU regulations are applied and the way that they are going to start affecting exporting countries. So there's much more, not just about the rules themselves and in terms of product requirements, but also there's more in there about how products exported to the EU must be produced and packaged outside of the Union. And so that's something that is new and has important implications. And there's also, alongside that, a growing demand for information to be able to evidence how these products are being produced and that they're meeting European expectations. So as I say, we'll come back to that later. Today, it's just an overview. We're going to give you some highlights about some of these upcoming initiatives and also about the programme. But as Skyner was explaining, this is an opening session, and we hope that you will follow up and contact us again if you need further information. I should mention that this is a programme that's funded by the European Commission, but the contents of the presentation are very much those that have been prepared and presented by COLEAD and do not directly reflect the views of the Commission. So just to give you a bit of background also on the organisation that we work for, COLEAD, it's actually a private sector association. So we're a not-for-profit. We've been functioning now for over 50 years, supporting market access. And our priority really is to facilitate and implement actions that support the contribution of the agricultural sector to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have a very particular history of working with the horticulture sector, and in particular the horticulture sector in Africa, Caribbean, Pacific countries. But as we go forward, we're increasingly also extending into other sectors and into other geographical areas, and extending the experience that we've had up until now working with ACP horticulture. So in order to conduct these actions, obviously we do some actions as an association representing our membership, but beyond that we implement development programs in the agriculture and food sector. And those are funded by donors, of which the European Union is by far the most important. So as COLEAD, we have a suite of different services and activities and also resources. As I said, many of these are really targeting Africa, Caribbean, Pacific horticulture, but there's a lot of resources online in our system that are also relevant to be used elsewhere. And so this webinar, this presentation that will be shared later, we have embedded links here that you can use to explore and just see a little bit more about what there is on offer. You know, in our library, we have technical guides, including plant health guides, etc. We have access to e-learning that is an open resource and covers quite a few different areas of activity, particularly sanitary and phytosanitary food safety, etc. But also moving into business development and sustainable production and trade. So I would encourage you after this call to have a look at what's available there on our COLEAD website, as you might find that there are resources that are valuable for you. But if I start going into a bit more detail now, so next slide, please, Chris. To actually introduce you to the AGRINFO program. This is something that's relatively new, and it's an initiative that we have developed really in partnership with the European Commission. It's building on work that we've been doing for some time as COLEAD with the horticulture sector, but the Commission recognised that it was filling a gap, and they were keen to work with us to be able to make this service, if you like, more widely available to other countries and also to other sectors. So basically, AGRINFO is an information service, and it's been developed really at a time when there's some very major changes going on in the EU regulatory environment. You've heard mention already of the EU Green Deal, and there's a lot of discussion around the world in EU trading, amongst EU trading partners, about what the EU Green Deal is and what it means for them. So basically, the Green Deal is a set of policies, and as Dr. Kingsley mentioned earlier, this is really targeting the EU environment, and it's aiming to make the EU climate neutral by 2050. It involves a whole set of policies that cut across all aspects of life, really, within the European Union, not just agriculture and food, but today we will obviously be focusing on that. And it comes with targets for European producers and European suppliers. But what's really important to take on board is that while these are primarily addressing what's happening within Europe, there is a significant impact on the food sector beyond European borders. One really important part of the European deal is the farm to fork strategy. In the diagram on the right, you can see all the really main areas of activity and the way that it's organized within the European deal to roll out this new policy framework. The one that's really important to us is the farm to fork strategy. So this sets out the goals, the targets, and the various different initiatives that are being put in place to try and improve and enhance and ensure the sustainability of the European food system. And so in terms of the impact that this is having on other countries, some of it is indirect, but also some of it is direct, where the EU actively aims to influence how sustainable food production is supported and encouraged in other parts of the world. And so, you know, the European Union has ambitions here to actually really promote sustainable food systems globally. And it sees the Green Deal really as a sort of global standard in some respects. That's fine, Chris, you can go to the next slide. As part of this farm to fork strategy, this is a bit alarming, this slide. We don't want to alarm you, but it's just to sort of make you aware that really every aspect of the governance really and the sort of management and implementation of this sustainable food system dialogue, it's having an impact on just about all aspects of the regulatory environment. And so you can see there on the right a quick listing, but it's not exhaustive, of the various different aspects of EU legislation that are already being affected by changes that are taking place in the EU Green Deal, all about making the food system more sustainable. A really important area is what's becoming known as these due diligence initiatives. Chris is going to give you more information on those later, but this is a really important new development, and it's part of this, you know, sustainable food system framework, which is this sort of overarching policy environment being developed within Europe. There's a number of initiatives in there that are becoming known as really due diligence, and that's all about providing the information to prove that you're doing the right thing and you're producing and supplying in accordance with these requirements that are coming out of Europe. But we'll come back to those later, because those are some of the most important things to be telling you about really in this overview today. So next slide, please, Chris. Why have we got the AGRINFO program? Why did this develop? Well, it's really recognizing that a lot of things are happening. The European is transparent about the way it does business, and it actually provides lots of opportunities for trading partners and European stakeholders to feed into the regulatory process so that they can give feedback on how it affects them and how they see that it could be positive or negative. They could provide comments that it's intended will be taken into account by those who are setting the regulations. So it's transparent also in the information that it makes available about the regulatory system in place and the individual regulations and how to access European markets. The problem is this information is often very complex, it's difficult to find, it's spread around many different websites and many different initiatives, for example, such as access to markets, which is something that we'll come back and mention later. And so really this partnership with the European Commission to develop AGRINFO recognised this complexity and came up with a proposal to try to make information easier to find and easier to be able to negotiate and to understand. And so the AGRINFO program was first, that's fine, Chris, go to the next slide. It began a couple of years ago. We had, in 2022, the year was spent really putting together the information system, and we've now been operating for 1 year during the course of 2023. So we're just starting really our second year implementation. So we're still growing, we're still learning, and we're still improving on the delivery of this information system. So essentially what we have produced is this single portal, a database that brings together and builds on existing resources. So you can see the link there to the database. An important thing to highlight here is this database doesn't include everything on EU regulations. What we do is to focus on what's new and what's changing. There are links on our site that take you to other resources that will tell you more about, if you say, I want to export a particular commodity, it'll tell you, much more comprehensively all the detail that you need to have on that particular commodity. We're very much focusing on what's new so that that information gets to you quickly and that you can act on it in time to avoid any trade disruption. We cover all agri-food and fish value chains that are linked to the EU market. We're very much focused on countries that are exporting from low and middle income countries. So it doesn't include, for example, a lot of detail on what you might need to do from the US, for example. It's very much focused on a specific focus group of partners. And the information that is included in there targets really competent authorities, producers, exporters, and farmer associations and entities such as yourselves. So there are three main areas of activity. First of all is what we do. We monitor and we document changes to EU policies and regulations. And so we're doing that on an ongoing basis. And weekly, we're updating the database to inform of any important changes to the regulations that could have an impact on trading partners. We also, in those records, try to put more information to really not just list the regulations and explain what's changing, but also to try to understand amongst ourselves what the potential implications of those are for trading partners. And there also we look to have a dialogue with organisations such as yourselves who can give us important feedback on what those implications might be for you. And finally, we try to communicate with our partners such as yourselves. So we really welcome the opportunity to hold webinars such as this, where we can talk directly to entities who need this information and need to be able to access it. So next slide, please, Chris. We'll be going on here. I think I'm going to be handing over to Chris. If you could go on to the next slide. I think I'm going on a little bit longer before I hand over to Chris. So as I mentioned in one of the early slides, there are these sort of three areas where exporting countries and exporters are likely to be affected. And one of those is not the main, new EU Green Deal initiatives, but really by applying the existing rules much more strictly. And some of these stricter rules, while they're really targeting production in Europe, they're also likely to have impacts on non-EU countries as well. So as was mentioned earlier in the introduction, the EU has set some really strict targets for EU production. So for example, this 50% decrease in the use of pesticides by 2030, and also an associated decrease in the use of more harmful pesticides, 20% reduction in use of fertilizer, increase in the use of organic production, etc. There's lots of really demanding targets. And these are really, the important message is that these are targeting European farmers and the European food industry, but inevitably they're starting to affect imported goods. And so the real message here is that there's no complacency by anybody who's supplying the EU market, because non-EU suppliers also are going to have to adapt. And so this is why these stricter rules are coming in. So next slide, please, Chris. Okay, here I'm going to hand over to Chris, who is going to talk about one of the areas where you're very likely already affected, and it's a really important area of interest for exporting countries. So Chris, I'll hand over to you now to take the floor for a while.
Thank you very much, Morag, and good afternoon, everybody. So, as Morag was saying, yes, there are stricter rules coming into force. And what we saw, for example, in 2023, we saw that there were changes or proposed changes to pesticide residue, maximum residue levels in excess of 90 pesticides in 2023. So just to give a little bit of context, why is the EU making so many changes, and how does this process work? So as you will know, there are hundreds of pesticides authorized in the EU, and the EU regularly reviews these MRLs, and when they do this review, the MRLs can be raised or they can be lowered. A second reason for changing MRLs is there is simply a request from a producer, normally from a manufacturer of a pesticide, for a new MRL on a given crop, and that will be adopted or rejected. What is particularly significant in the context of the Green Deal is, as Morag was saying, there is an aim to reduce the use of pesticides in the EU. And that means that when a pesticide is no longer used, there will be a reduction or removal generally of the MRL, or a reduction to the lowest level possible, the limit of detection, as we call it. Now, this is not a random process. In each of these scenarios, there is an evaluation, a risk assessment done by the body that is responsible for science, the European Food Safety Authority, and the EFSA will then make an opinion, a recommendation on every single pesticide and every single MRL, and then it is up to the European Commission as the central point in Brussels to make a proposal and to discuss with all the member states around Europe. Once they've had that discussion, what the Commission will do is they will notify the World Trade Organization. So they will circulate that proposal to all the members of the WTO, and this is an opportunity for WTO members, including Sri Lanka, to make comments, give their input, give their reflections on the proposal that the Commission is coming forward with, and they have a 60-day period to do that. So, one of the things we also try and make sure in our newsletters and when we're informing is to inform of that process as well, to give the maximum chance for trading partners to be reflecting on upcoming changes. After they've taken the feedback from WTO members, there is a reflection again within the European Union and a final discussion and approval of that MRL that's published. And there will be normally a transition period of 6 months, so people have 6 months to adapt, and then the new maximum residue level will come into force. The most problematic of these different scenarios is when a pesticide is no longer used in the EU. So this is primarily aimed at EU farmers. There is an evaluation and a decision that for reasons of health, reasons of safety, or simply that there is no economic interest in still having that pesticide on the market, that pesticide is no longer permitted to be used in the EU. And this means that almost automatically there is a reduction of the maximum residue level to the lowest possible level, which could be 0.01, 0.05, depending on the pesticide. And then, of course, this also has an impact on those countries that are exporting to the EU who have to meet the same rules. And so producers are in the position in other countries that they have to find alternatives. So either a non-chemical solution that can replace the pesticide in question, they have to find alternative pesticides, or potentially that they have to amend good agricultural practice to ensure that there are no residues. And often here, when we're talking about phasing out, the EU is no longer permitting the use of a pesticide. We are talking about some of the older pesticides, but also we're talking about pesticides that are very widely and commonly used around the world. So even though these regulations are targeted particularly at EU agriculture and EU farmers, of course, this will have an effect on non-EU countries. And one of the problems which is not always reflected in the EU process is, of course, in other countries like Sri Lanka, you are potentially facing different climate and different pest challenges to the ones that we face in the EU. And therefore, it may not be simple always to be finding alternatives to these pesticides. The reason we highlight this issue in particular is because what we see from the data is that this is a major issue for Sri Lankan exports. This is there is a system in Europe that when a consignment of food is blocked in the European Union for reasons of non-compliance, that meaning that the food safety rules are not being met, information is sent by the national authorities to the European Commission, and that is collected in what is known as the Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed, RASF. And when we look at the data for Sri Lanka, there were 30 consignments blocked in 2023, and there were problems in relation to fish, food additives, contaminants, but the vast majority, 62% of consignments that were blocked were in relation to pesticide residues. And here, these are the products that were effective and the pesticides that were relevant. But it is not just a problem for the individual consignment. So there is also a rule, a set of rules in the EU that allows the EU to increase controls where they feel there is a potential health, a risk to public health. So when there have been frequent non-compliances, so when consignments, a number of consignments are identified in a given sector on a given product as being problematic in relation to mycotoxins or pesticide residues, the EU has the power to increase the frequency of the controls as those products arrive in the EU. And this is known as Annex 1. This is the first step. This is the first step that EU authorities will take to increase controls of products that they identify as potentially problematic. And this is already the case for two Sri Lankan products. I won't embarrass myself by trying to pronounce those, but it is the case that already on these two products, there are 50% of consignments that are checked for pesticide residues. And we would just like to underline that there are changes upcoming. So from 5 February 2024, for Sri Lankan yard-long beans, there will also be an increased number of checks. 20% of consignments will be checked for pesticide residues. If the non-compliance continues, that is that if these checks, there is a continued problem, then the EU has the possibility of putting products on what we call Annex 2, and that requires even stricter rules. So there needs to be for all exports sampling laboratory analysis by competent authorities, and there will need to be official certificates for each consignment prior to export. And this is already the case today for Sri Lankan peppers, where certificates are required, and 50% of the consignments are analysed for pesticide residues. In this context, therefore, it's extremely important that all pesticide residue changes are monitored, and that operators are trying to keep up with changes to EU rules. And we hope and we believe that the AgriInfo tool will help you in this process of identifying upcoming changes, but also keep an eye on these changing import controls as well. Over to you, Morag.
Thanks, Chris. I'm sure, you know, we're speaking here today with the Export Development Board, we're speaking with, I'm sure, lots of business people, and you'll be only too aware of the cost implications for when, you know, increased controls are imposed by the European Union or when consignments are blocked. So, you know, the real-time impact of those on trade are very, very important. And so, as Chris was emphasising, you know, keeping up with the regulations and ensuring compliance is really important from a business perspective. For the second section that we're going to talk about today, it's not really, you know, the pesticides were an example of how rules are getting stricter, but the rules were already there and we're used to working with them. Here we have a different set of things happening. We have regulations that are having an influence on how products are produced in non-EU countries. It's not just what, but it's also how. So next slide, please, Chris. So these are having quite big, potentially big implications as time goes forward. The reason that they're here, you know, is going back to the Green Deal. The EU is raising the environmental and social standards about what's happening in Europe. But there are concerns that if they make things really strict for European producers, consumers might import products from countries, you know, where there are lower standards. And why this might happen is really because, you know, if it's becoming harder and you've got really strict rules in Europe, it means that it costs more for European producers. And so prices of European produced products may go up, which will make products in other countries more competitive. And so they're quite worried that if this happens, actually they could shift bad practice from Europe to other countries where the standards are not necessarily yet as high. So to avoid this, they're really saying that, well, if we're putting these rules in place, they're going to have an impact on European farmers. We need to make sure that those same rules are there and applied elsewhere. And not only that, once you start asking for, you know, people to do things in a different way and to produce according to certain requirements in terms of the how, they also need information and evidence so that they can demonstrate, you know, and check that those demands are being met. And we'll get back to this in the next section, which is all about the due diligence and about providing that information. But it's really important, you know, to recognise that some of these changes might be not so easy to make, particularly in the timescale that is being written into these regulatory changes. And there may also, in the same way that, you know, pesticide non-compliance has an associated cost for the export sector, when you're actually asking for more information, as well as changes to the way that these products are supplied and produced, there may be cost implications there also. And so we just wanted to highlight this as being, you know, an area that you as an export development board and its members, I'm sure, will want to follow. So next slide, please, Chris. One of the things that we wanted to mention today, recognising that Sri Lanka exports, you know, quite a lot of products under organic certification. All of you who are involved in organic exports here that are in the call today, I'm sure will be aware that things have been happening and that things have been changing and potentially are getting a bit more difficult. And these again are really looking at how organic products are produced and supplied, and also the evidence that needs to be provided of their organic, that they meet organic principles. The really big change that's happened is that the new regulations have changed from what's known as this system of equivalence to a system of conformity. Now, the system of equivalence that I know that you've been producing under in Sri Lanka, and you had your own, I think you've got an organic, national organic movement there that's been setting the standards for Sri Lanka. It was possible under the old regulation to produce things in ways that were different to the way they were being produced in the EU, but they were having, the outcome was the same, and it was accepted that what you were producing according to Sri Lankan principles were aligned with the overall principles of organic production and meeting the requirements of European buyers. What's happened now is that this equivalence principle has been lost. And so under the new regulation, what's required is strict conformity with the same set of rules. So whether you're producing in Europe or whether you're producing in Sri Lanka, the rules are exactly the same. So there's no possibility to recognize that you might do things differently in Sri Lanka, but they're equivalent. The reason that the European Union did this under the new regulation was that they were under pressure to clarify the rules and remove certain inconsistencies that had been recognized that were actually giving rise to trade complaints and disputes. But also, they were under a lot of pressure from European producers to align production outside Europe with what was happening in Europe, because I think European producers, organic producers, felt that they were at a disadvantage. And so this was the background and why they switched to this conformity approach. But it has really important implications for the way the organic rules are now applied. Next, please, Chris. I know that organic is something that is important in Sri Lanka, and it may be that the information that we're giving today is really not what you're looking for, because it's really quite superficial. There are so many really important changes that are happening. Understanding those changes is very important, but also applying them fairly quickly. Many of these have to be in place by the end of 2024. You may decide that you want more information on these things. And so what I want to mention now, but this applies also to some of the other topics that we're covering today, that if you wanted more real or practical guidance on how to implement some of these things, we could organise a follow-up webinar on the organic regulation, and we would do that in collaboration with FEEBLE, the organic movement. So really, just to give you a very quick overview of what's happening, you've got this loss of equivalence, which means that you've lost the ability to adapt the requirements to local conditions and local traditional organic practices in Sri Lanka. Another important area is that in terms of the substances that you can use, we know that many plant extracts, etc., are used in plant protection, and that they've always been accepted by your certification body equivalent standards. That's now changing, and there is a list under the new regulation of the substances that can be used both as manures, for pest control, as disinfectants, etc. And so this list affects everybody, whether you're producing in Europe or whether you're producing in Sri Lanka. There are possibilities of adding things to that list, to an annex within the regulation, for substances that could be used in a certain area, which could be, an area within a country, or it could be a region. And you can get this approval, a bit like you get approval for the use of a pesticide, and that would last you for 2 years. There are some concerns about the timescale, because it does take a bit of work to get that in place, and it's the process for submitting a dossier to get it approved is a bit complex. But we're doing that as COLEAD for some products already in organic horticulture in some countries in Africa, to try to get certain biocontrol products listed. Something, I don't know if we have anybody organic on the call here, but for example, if you're using a biocontrol product, you need to check that not only that product, but also the strain is registered in Europe. If not, you might need to register that strain for use in Sri Lanka. So you can come back to us afterwards with questions on that, and we could follow up after the call, but it is quite an important area that needs to be taken in mind. The other thing that has changed that's of really significant importance is the way that group certification is happening now under the new regulation. So group certification was something that used to only be applied in third countries, so it was not something that could be done in Europe itself. Now you can have groups anywhere in the world. And there are really strict rules now about the size. So the maximum size of a group will be 2,000 members. Each of those members has to be less than 5 hectares. You've got a plantation crop, for example, and you're bigger than 5 hectares, then it needs to be no more than 2% of your profit or your returns from your sales of organic products, or 25,000 euro ceiling. Groups that you might have, some producers, groups of producers were linked to a trader, so the trader managed the certification process, etc., and the trader was the recognised organic entity. That will no longer be permitted, and groups of farmers must have their own legal entity and operate completely independently. And those groups must meet certain requirements, such as having a joint marketing system. They must be reasonably close to each other in terms of geographical location. And each of those groups, so separated from their buyer or their cooperative, they must have their own internal control system and somebody responsible for that. There's a lot more information about this on our website, and you can have a look at that later. But the transition, I think that this confused everybody really as this new regulation was rolled out. The transition is linked to the recognition of your certification body by the European Union under the new regime. And so many certification bodies are leaving that quite late, and so they're probably not going to be recognised until the end of this year, and they have to be recognised, by the start of 2025. Whenever your certification body becomes recognised, then you have to apply all of these new rules about farmer groups, etc. Up until the point that your certification body is officially recognised, you can continue doing what you've been doing up until now. But if you're, operating with certification bodies, 24th of December is the really important date. The other date that you see on there, 2026, relates to countries who have had their own existing equivalent system that was recognised by the EU. So there's lots of complexity here. And, we can answer questions either later in the call or following the call for anyone who's particularly interested in organic production. So I think, Chris, it's now back over to you.
Thank you, Morag. Yes, so one of the Green Deal initiatives that has received the greatest attention, and potentially the one that may have the greatest implications in terms of change for supplying countries, is the EU deforestation regulation. So why is the EU taking action? Well, EU is a massive importers of certain products, and it's calculated that between 1990 and 2008, the EU consumption of these products was responsible for 10% of worldwide deforestation. So the intention with this legislation is really to account for and try to ensure that EU consumption of products that are imported do not contribute to deforestation. Now, the EU looked at a whole range of products and decided to focus on 7 commodities, and these are the 7 commodities that they estimate contribute to 98% of the EU driven deforestation, and these products are cattle and products related to cattle, cocoa, palm oil, coffee, soybean. In addition to that, natural rubber and timber are also included within the scope of this regulation. This is not the end of the story. There will be a review after 2 years, and it is possible that other products would also at a later stage be added to be included in the scope of this deforestation regulation. Now, this is a very complicated piece of legislation. So really here, the intention is just to give the overview. Again, there's more information on our website. What are the main implications? from the end of this year, all products that are sold of these products that were mentioned on the previous slide, if they are placed on the EU market, they have to be deforestation free and they have to be legal. Now, what does this mean? Deforestation free means that the plot of land where these products were grown, there have to be certainty that there was no deforestation has taken place after 31 December 2020. This was a cutoff date, and there is a obligation on producers to provide information that will help the importers to demonstrate that this is the case. And so specifically, there is a need to identify the specific plot of land where the products were grown, and this is geolocation data is used to map the specific plot of land where the cocoa or the coffee or the palm oil initiated, and to indicate the date and time range of production to demonstrate that there was no deforestation related to this production. And a second aspect is that these products have to be legal, and that means that they have to be produced in line with the relevant laws of the country of production. And these laws can be related to land use rights, environmental protection, forest-related regulations, labor rights, and these are just examples. So in each country, there is a need for the public sector and the private sector to clarify, which are the relevant rules of production in the country to ensure there again that information can be given to demonstrate that these products were produced legally. The greatest challenge, of course, in this is the organization of systems, supply systems in various countries that make this process very, very complicated, because the information on the geolocation of the product and information on legality has to be passed through right through the chain, so from the collector to the supplier to the market, and every shipment that comes to Europe has to be associated and linked to this information. And it is not possible, not permitted to mix product from non-deforested areas with product that is from an area that is deforested. It is also not possible to mix product but where the origin of the product is not known. So this creates an enormous challenge for suppliers in terms of traceability and segregation. Now, the regulation itself is not explicit. It doesn't say how traceability has to be organized, but simply that this process has to take place. So the businesses that put the product on the EU market, so the importers, must be able to demonstrate that the information is reliable, so that they have a functioning traceability system in place. And this means that a lot of the existing systems, such as mass balanced chain of custody, this does not necessarily today provide those guarantees, and therefore it does imply a rethinking of the entire supply chain in virtually all the countries that are implicated by this regulation. And the additional challenge is the time frame that has been set by the EU. So these new systems have to be in place by the end of the year. And of course, the response to these challenges will be very specific, not only according to the country and how those supply chains are organized, but even the individual sector. So here we're just giving a general overview, but of course the response in Sri Lanka and the response in other countries will vary very much from country to country. Another regulation that is also going to have a longer term impact on supply is sustainable packaging. And this is certainly, if you are exporting packaged foods today, this is certainly something that very much needs to be on your radar. So the idea generally, and this is this discussion in Europe is underway, is to revise the current rules on packaging to respond to specific environmental concerns, but also to reflect changes in packing technologies. And the bottom line is that the new packaging requirements will require greater focus on sustainability. So within the new rules, there will be very specific requirements relating to levels of heavy metals, the amount that packaging can be recyclable, the amount of plastic, the amount of recycled plastic that must be contained in plastic packaging. And also there are rules foreseen in relation to the size of packaging and an obligation to make packaging as small as possible. Now, as I say, these rules are still currently being discussed, so the details of these rules are not yet finalized. A further element is how to demonstrate that compliance is being met. So there will be a need for all exporters of packaged material to be able to demonstrate that those sustainability requirements have been met. And this will mean that packaging manufacturers, also in outside the EU, will have to ensure that they have the technical documentation that can demonstrate that all these sustainable requirements have been fulfilled. And this information must be passed right along the supply chain, not dissimilarly to what we've just seen in the case of deforestation. Now, if you are exporting fruit and vegetables specifically, there is also a potential, and this is still under discussion, of a ban on single-use plastic packaging in relation to fresh fruit and vegetables in small quantities. So when the packaging is less than 1.5 kilos. Now, this is something that a number of EU member states unilaterally have already introduced, and therefore that has provoked the discussion within this review of packaging rules on the potential of applying such a EU-wide ban on single-use plastics for these specific products on a more general scale. Another element that is relevant to fruit and vegetables specifically is that the sticky labels that are stuck on fruit and vegetables, they will have to be compostable. So, as I say, this is still under discussion. Very concretely, the European Council, there's discussion between all the EU institutions, and those discussions are expected to continue throughout 2024. And the current prediction on the timetable for the new rules applying, potentially 2028, but with those new sustainability requirements and the need for technical documentation, those coming in 2030. So this is not an immediate concern perhaps for you, but it is certainly something that absolutely needs to be on your radar, because it will imply potentially significant changes in terms of packaging and the sourcing of packaging. I think I'm handing over to you, Morag. Oh no, so sorry, beg your pardon. This is still me. So the third area of change is, as Morag has mentioned before, an increased demand for information on production. So there is growing pressure for more information about how products are made, and a greater attention to the impact of EU businesses in non-EU countries. And there are a series of pieces of legislation that are upcoming that will determine what sort of information will have to be provided throughout the chain. And so there is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that is already in place, but we have three pieces of due diligence legislation that are still under discussion. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. We have sustainability labeling and green claims, and we have a piece of legislation that looks to put a ban on products that are made with forced labor. And each of these pieces, each of these rules will determine, will require companies to provide information. So to take the due diligence directive, so this is really aimed at large EU companies. So we're talking companies with over 150 million euros turnover, and non-EU, excuse me, non-EU agri-food companies with a turnover of above 40 million euros in the EU, and they must complete a process that is called due diligence. What does due diligence mean? Due diligence means that the company concerned has to identify any potential negative impacts in the chain, and this can be related to the environment, or this can be related to respect of human rights. And as the EU company does this exercise, identifies potential impacts, they also have to develop strategies to respond to the problems they identify. So they have to take steps that will prevent and reduce, and where possible, rectify the negative impacts that they identify in their supply chain. And of course, in doing this, they have to be able to demonstrate that they have taken those steps and prove that, in fact, that the products, when they arrive in Europe, have not resulted in negative impacts either on the environment or on human rights. Now, this is not likely to have a direct impact on companies in Sri Lanka. There will be no obligation for US companies to be undertaking the due diligence exercise, the review of supply chains that the EU companies will be legally obliged to do. However, in order for the EU companies to respond to their obligations, they will be needing more information from you as suppliers, because they will need to be demonstrating that environment and human rights are being respected. And this will raise a number of challenges. The first is, what information will we be needing from suppliers? And this is a little bit more complicated than in the case of deforestation. In the deforestation regulation, the requirements are relatively clear. But in the case of due diligence, it may be the case that buyers will each have their own approach, their own strategy towards due diligence, and therefore, at an early stage, it is extremely important that as suppliers, you enter into dialogue with buyers to determine exactly what sort of information is required. There is then the process of collecting that information in order to support those demands from buyers. Certification could potentially be one strategy. So if you are involved in certification schemes, this may be very helpful for a buyer in terms of demonstrating elements of compliance. But the reality is today that the certification schemes that are in place do not cover all aspects, will likely not cover all aspects of the environmental and human rights issues that are going to be covered by this regulation. So there will be a need for certification schemes potentially to adapt, but there will also need to be a reflection on which information can be provided within the scheme, or which additional information is required. And I think that one of the big worries from a number of countries is that certain countries or certain sectors will become blacklisted, or there will be a feeling that there's not confidence in certain regions or certain countries, and therefore suppliers that are entirely respecting the environment and respecting human rights could potentially be classified or seen as a sort of high risk source in relation to these issues. Now, the content, the precise content, it is still under discussion. The new rules are expected to be finalized in the coming months, and then will come into application in 2026. And there is a very intensive, there are very intensive discussions going on in EU industry at the moment, trying to work out what precisely the implications are of these new rules, and what this will mean in terms of demands on suppliers. But that is still certainly that's still an ongoing process. We will have to wait a little bit for the outcome of these discussions, and then certainly on our website, what we intend to do once these rules are finalized is also not only providing the information on the rules, but also access to the guidance and follow-up that is being undertaken by the food industry, to try and give as soon as we can a clearer idea of what the implications are of this on US suppliers. Finally, another piece of Green Deal legislation, which again is something, this is not immediate, but also probably something that just to keep on your radar. And this is relation to environmental, what we call in Europe, green claims. And the reason for this is on the European market at the moment, you will find a number of claims on products about the environmental performance of the product, or its environmental credentials. And the EU considers that many of these environmental claims are not really valid, and there is a process of what we call greenwashing. So there is a need, the EU perceives a need to introduce new legislation that will provide a framework for clarifying and justifying any claims on products that are made about the environment. And the implications of this, that in the future, all environmental claims on products will have to be approved. And approval is not expected to be an easy process. The companies will have to provide a significant amount of data in order to justify any claims that they are making. So this is, again, another example of where potentially in the future, buyers will be coming to you. If the buyers that you are supplying to are interested in making environmental claims, they will be turning to you for more data on production processes, on the processing within factories, to understand the environmental implications, so that they in the future can be potentially making environmental claims on the final products. Again, this is at an a relatively early stage. There are still discussions ongoing, and the new rules in this area are expected to apply in 2027 or 2028. And I think I hand back to Morag here.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So just to recap, you know, this is the focus of our discussion today has been trying to just give you a flavour, if you like, of what's happening in Europe under the Green Deal, because there is a lot of misunderstanding about what it really, you know, what this term means for trading partners. So we have this issue, we have stricter rules, we have impacts on how products are produced and packaged, and then we have these new demands for information that are going to be applied. We don't know when, we don't know exactly what as yet, because this is still, you know, very much a sort of moving situation and under development. But it's important to be aware of what's happening and to be prepared for it, because, you know, some of these changes are going to require a lot of activity and by trading partners in order to ensure that they are compliant and compliant in time. So it's important to keep monitoring what's happening, to know, and also where possible to engage in it and to give feedback. As I mentioned earlier, know that generally with new Commission regulations, there are opportunities for the public to feed in their views. But, you know, we recommend that you keep monitoring the AGRINFO website so that we will keep you up to date on whenever there's new developments. And it'll be really important, you know, in actually adapting as a sector, or as a, you know, as an export sector, or as an individual commodity sector, etc., to ensure that there's a coordinated response to these new rules. You know, there may be requirements on the public sector to put in place. I think we've had some interesting questions in the Q&A already about, you know, how verification will be done, and there may be roles for national public sectors, for example, in this aspect. But obviously, very clearly, there will be big obligations on the private sector to put in place the necessary changes. And so having a really strong public-private sector dialogue, as I'm sure you will have already in an organisation such as EDB, will become increasingly important to ensure that you have a systematic response to the regulations as they rolled out. So next, please, Chris. Finally, we're going to just come back to quickly having a recap also about the AGRINFO platform, because obviously, you know, the purpose of today is partly to give you a quick overview of what's happening, so you're sort of clearer about why you're probably seeing some of these terms and some of these issues being mentioned in your press, and perhaps, you know, with information that's being given by your buyers in Europe. But also today is a really important opportunity for us as AGRINFO to tell you more about the AGRINFO information service and how you can use it and what we can do for you. We are a non-profit organisation, and this is a service that's provided by the European Commission. It's funded by the European Commission. And so there is not a cost to you to accessing the information that we provide, and we want to emphasise that. What we try to do is to give you up-to-date information on what's happening. You know, we give an overview for each new piece of regulation about what it actually is, hopefully in a form and using language that is easily accessible and easily translatable. We tell you when that's happening and when new regulations are coming into place, and we give you a very quick overview of what the various different stakeholders, whether that's a producer, an exporter, or a public sector authority, what do the various stakeholders need to do in order to ensure compliance and to avoid any potential trade disruption. Also, something that we want to really emphasize here is that it's important to understand the implications of new regulations, not only when they come into force, but as early as possible when they're under development. We need to know what these impacts are going to be, what potentially, and also what they might mean for different countries and sectors, because obviously that will vary very significantly. Some, as we've seen with the deforestation regulations, some sectors are affected and others are not. But understanding these at an early stage, well before they're applied, is really important in order that you can put in place the measures that you need to comply, and also importantly to engage and give feedback. And that feedback you can give via us or by engaging directly with the European Commission services. And another important thing to highlight, I think there was a question perhaps put in the Q&A about what other programs, it was in the context of organic, what other programs and support is available to help Sri Lankan exporters and producers comply with the new organic requirements. Maybe there is a need for more accompanying measures, either through, through your national stakeholders in Sri Lanka or potentially through donors. But it's really important early on to recognise if a new requirement is going to have such big implications for a particular sector or a particular group of stakeholders, what technical and financial assistance may you need in order to adapt? And also what of that technical and financial assistance is already available. So we really want to emphasise that through the AGRINFO programme, we want to go and help with those other steps as well as understanding what the implications are and what you may need to do. So next slide, please, Chris. So in the Q&A, I've already been putting some links to relevant records. We have at the moment over 300 records on the site, and those records are predominantly on regulations that have been introduced since the start of 2022, or perhaps, since the start of 2023 and part of 2022. So we're focusing, as I said right at the beginning, on what's changing rather than on everything that you might need to do and everything that relates to existing legislation. On those embedded photographs that you can see there of our website, we have links, and those are to other resources that you might need. And those include, for example, access to markets, which you can see there on the screen, and you can access this link through our website. This gives you much more of an overview of, say, if you wanted to export coffee, what are the tariffs, what are the procedures, what are all of the requirements and rules already in place. And so AGRINFO is something that you need to use as well as other things. And some of the questions that have been coming up in the Q&A, you might be better to have a look on access to markets if you don't find that information on our site. We do have an Ask AGRINFO service, and I've put links to that in response to some of the questions that we've already received today. Detailed questions that we don't have, we can't answer without doing a bit more research. And so if you do want to follow up on those questions or potentially others, you can use this Ask AGRINFO service, which we can respond directly to your email address. And finally, I don't think we're going to have time to demonstrate it today, but you can search our website using various different routes, keywords, HS codes, etc., to find what it is that is most relevant to you. So Chris has put the example here. If you put in clothes, it comes up with these two records showing you where changes have taken place within the last year that could potentially affect clothes producers and things that are important for you to know. So please, after the call, feel free to have a look at the website and see what might be interesting for you. Another thing that we wanted to highlight was that we produce a newsletter every 2 or 3 weeks, and in that newsletter we highlight the changes that have come in the intervening period. So we're constantly monitoring what's coming out of the European Commission, and everything that's relevant to our partner countries we'll produce a record as quickly as we can, because we feel that it's really important for you to be able to anticipate changes and to give you the maximum amount of time to adapt. And so these records are not just about when a new piece of policy or legislation comes into place, but we give you quite a lot, as much lead up time as we can from when we first see that this change is likely to happen. Also, something that Chris mentioned earlier on that's very important, whenever there's a significant new item of legislation that's introduced by the European Union or by any other of your trading partners, they have to, if they are WTO members, they have to notify that to the World Trade Organization. And always, when there is this type of notification, there's a 60-day period where countries can respond and say, we really object to this because it could affect us negatively. We really recommend that you reconsider, and perhaps change some aspects of it or give us a longer period to adapt. In Sri Lanka, you will have national contact points, national WTO contact points, and those are the entities that you would need to contact to put together a response to the WTO. There is more information on that also on our website, and if you have any difficulty finding it, as I said, you could just send us a message through Ask AgriNFO. So here, I think that this presentation will be shared to all the participants afterwards, and you'll find that the links both to subscribe to the website. I should have mentioned that, sorry. Yeah, this newsletter, it's freely available to anybody. So if you would like to receive it directly into your inbox, just use that link to subscribe. And we generally ask a bit of background information about you. So, for example, what you're interested in terms of commodities, etc. And the reason that we do that is because we also try to, if we see something really important coming out, sometimes a change in pesticide MRL or a new plant health regulation, an emergency measure, there's really often very little time to adapt. And so when we see that happening, we send out an email alert to everybody who we think will be affected by it in our database. And so if, for example, you list yourself as an exporter of honey, during the last year, we've sent out a couple of alerts about changes to regulations that are really important for honey exporters. And so that's the reason that we ask for that information. And so, as I said before, if you've got specific questions, they can go through the Ask AgriNFO site. If you're interested in being on our contact list so that we can send you alerts if anything really significant that's relevant to you, again, please make a note of those interests when you go through the subscription process. And finally, one other thing that I'd mention, for example, in the context of organic, if you want more detailed webinars to explain certain key changes or key initiatives, we can't promise that we can deliver everything, but we can try to meet your needs if we're able. And so sometimes we will ask, if it's something very specialist, we will look for third-party expertise to help us do that. And also the European Commission can help us to formalize information, and sometimes we'll even take part in webinars also. So we just wanted to mention that today in case you would want to follow up on anything that you've heard today. So at this point, I will hand back to the organisers to see if we've got any more questions. We've been answering some of them in the Q&A as we go along, and there are already a couple of questions in there. One of them, I think, is really not for us. It's asking about training and education programs that are available in Sri Lanka on organic farming, but perhaps somebody in the development board that can help us with that in the Export Development Board, that they might have more information on that. Another very interesting point that's been made there, I don't know if you can all see the Q&A, is about how we follow the traceability requirements and also what the role of certification And you raise the issue there of the cost of certification, which we very well recognise because, you know, in the fruit and vegetable sector where we have a lot of experience, the cost of certification to demonstrate compliance with Global Gap or organic or whatever, it is really significant, especially for smaller scale entities. And so one thing that's a bit of an uncertainty about all of these due diligence initiatives that Chris was mentioning is the role that certification might take. But there is a strong likelihood that these will become the way that European buyers demonstrate their due diligence, demonstrate that they're doing the right thing. And so we're assuming that some of the certification schemes are going to be adapting in order to incorporate some of these new requirements. But at the moment, it is a big unknown. And cost, I can't hide this. It is obviously a real concern. And there are discussions about the extent to which, you know, the cost of asking people to do more are going to be covered by increasing the price. But, you know, that's a discussion that's beyond us and for another day. So, Chris, there's a question there about geolocation. I don't know if you want to go into more detail about that, or if we would respond in writing. Can you see the Q&A, Chris? It's saying that I can read it out for you if you like. The deforestation regulation will need to be monitored by some regulated body. For example, FSC. So who's responsible for verification of the details provided by the supplier on the geolocation? It's a very, very interesting question. You know, it goes back to the question about whether it's a certification body or whether it's the buyer. And so depending on the actual commodity, we see it evolving in different ways. And in some cases, buyers are putting in place these traceability systems and their own verification systems. But it's again a discussion that's happening very live at the moment. And if you are exporting a product that's affected by it, you know, for example, coffee or cocoa, we recommend that you have a discussion with your buyer at the earliest opportunity, and also, you know, keep looking at what's coming out on AgriInfo as things develop. Chris, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, it's simply the legal responsibility is from the importer, or so the person who puts the products on the market is responsible for due diligence, which includes the verification of the details on geolocation. So that is the legal responsibility. But of course, they will need you know, support from suppliers in terms of providing evidence that this system is reliable. So the legal responsibility is on the person who places the product on the market as part of their due diligence.
So if there's any other questions, either today or if you think of them after the call, then, as I said, please send us your questions via the AgriInfo, Ask AgriInfo link. So, Ms. Gayani, perhaps we could hand back to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Moore and Dr. Chris, for very informative and very useful presentations done today. And also thank you for consideration for giving responses to the Q&A section and the questions raised by our participants. We understand that the EU Green Deal is not just a policy, but about the shared commitment to our planet's future. So actually, so far that we have received some of the request from some of our government institutions to organize few of the relevant webinars in future. So that details we will be shared with you and with those institutions, and we will see how best we could support for them as well. And if you have any more questions, dear participants, you can raise those questions. As our expert said, you can raise those questions directly to the COLEAD, or that you can send those to EDB, where that EDB could send those to the COLEAD requesting their responses. So with that note, I think with that time limitations, now we need to move to the closing remarks. So therefore, I would like to invite Director Agriculture, Mr. Janak Badugama, to deliver the closing remarks. And also, I should mention, sorry, that I should mention that we have put a poll on the screen. You can see a poll there, which contains some of the questions here. So please be good enough to respond those questions as well. So that will be useful to evaluate today's sessions, and also we can see what are the webinars or what kind of activities we can organize in future together with the COLEAD. Therefore, please respond to those questions as well. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Janak Badugama to deliver the closing remarks. Over to you, Mr. Janak.
So, thank you, Jani. Thank you. So that today we observed a successful implementation of a very valuable topic in a webinar, the EU Green Deal, so that basically focusing on EU market, so that everyone know that the importance of the EU market for Sri Lanka, one of the major markets for exportation of our country, whereas it's very important for us to understand time to time changes happen in the environment at the meantime, the challenges that we face. So, so we have covered fruitful discussion today. Thank you very much, Dr. Orag Webb, Dr. Chris Donner, Dr. Martin Brackle, for your valuable support today, as the contribution given is in fact open our eyes with reference to the challenges that we need to face in year 2028 and so forth, so that it is been an organization focused in exportation in Sri Lanka, so that it's our responsibility, Export Development Board's responsibility to give more and more information, up-to-date information to our stakeholders. So in that case, it is extremely valuable, your thoughts as well as the contribution given today, especially the idea of agriculture, organic agriculture, then certification, fertilizer utilization, and deforestation, so that child labor. We were discussing these facts. In fact, now we realize that, so that it is very, very important for us to handle these particular areas very carefully, because the time to come, unless otherwise we proactively activate, it is not possible our exporter to meet the EU regulation and also with the challenges in the EU region. So in that case, thank you very much, all of you from AGRINFO program of COLEAD European Union, for giving your support towards the Export Development Board. And in fact, it is an outcome of August 2023, as Ryan indicated, so that it's highlights your focus and also your commitments towards future success. So at the meantime, I take this opportunity to thank you and give my appreciation to my EDB staff, especially Guyani, and also the joint, I think almost 90 individuals joined today for the organizing the private sector as well as government sector joined the webinar today. So thank you very much all. So that please give your feedback to Guyani as well as directly you can communicate with it. So this ideal timing for us to open our eyes and so that with the futuristic aspect, so that what more important for us to bridge the gap as early as possible. So once again, thank you very much.
Thank you all for being a part of this timely webinar. Let's continue the dialogue. Let's keep the momentum and let's work together towards a greener and more sustainable tomorrow. Wishing you all a wonderful evening ahead. Thank you very much for all once again. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much also.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Chris,
you very
Dr.
much.
Mohan, and Dr. Martin.